Hello everyone, welcome back to the Grim Dawn class examination. This is the Paladin. Now, originally I was going to cover every single item, all of the sets, all of the, endgame legendaries and epics, but then I recalled that the last time I did that, it was a really long episode, so I'm actually going to break up the items into parts. So, basically, this is going to be part 2. Part 3 is going to discuss individual epics and legendaries, endgame individual epics and legendaries, and then Part 4 will discuss the monster infrequence available to the Paladin, and then we'll move into Devotion, and that'll clean up the series overall for a nice 5-part series. Now, back to the main point, we're going to be discussing endgame sets for the Paladin. Now, I believe I've used all of these at least once. If I bring up one, say, that I don't recognize as having used, I will mention it. But I'm pretty sure I've used all of these at least once. Some multiple times, I'll mention those as well. But let's pop right into it first with the Void Soul. Now, the Void Soul is a fairly interesting one, and this is one of the few ways I'll really bust out Flames of Ignifar with this combination, and that's primarily because of the decreased energy cost of Flames of Ignifar. Now, when you're running a Void Soul set, you're actually doing a very specific strategy. You run Avenging Shield, you run Reprisal. Reprisal is pretty much a necessity, by the way. You could run Aegis, I don't, I'll explain why in a bit. And then we also, of course, have Flames of Ignifar. And also, let's go back to the Void Soul now. Having just the complete set, obviously your fire damage is being converted to vitality damage with the Aegis of Men here. That's fine. By the way, I forgot to do one thing, which would be Path of the Three. Now, so we have, that's why we're not doing the Aegis of Thorns here. That's why we're not using this. Because we're already converting that fire damage to vitality damage. You would probably, what I would recommend you do is until you've got the complete set, go ahead and put the point in here for the Aegis of Thorns, and then once you have the complete set, then you pull out the point. Now, I mentioned that there's a very specific strategy involved here, and there is. Your actual strategy with this build is you're running up on a group of enemies, you open with Aegis of Men here, crisp up anybody who gets in melee range with you, right? And then just keep on throwing, keep on chucking shields as you need. Now, you'll also notice that I did not put a point into Tainted Flame. Again, you don't necessarily need to. Now, obviously here we have Vitality and Chaos damage. It's not converting, so it is strongly recommended. But if you don't want to, you're converting a lot of that into acid damage. It's really your choice. Obviously, it's a little bit better to have the Chaos and Vitality damage because you are increasing that anyways via this armor set. But don't feel obligated to do so if you don't want to. It's just very recommended. Now let's get into some of the other points of this set. Of course, you have all of this Chaos and Vitality damage increased. You have Elemental damage converted to Chaos damage, and this actually creates a very interesting opportunity for you if you choose, where you can actually throw points into Word of Pain, run all the way over here with it, and actually use that Chaos resistance, and that Elemental damage all along the line is being converted to Chaos. Now, remember, this is an option. This is not something you necessarily have to do. I actually don't use this unless I'm playing with multiplayer. And yes, I have used this set a bunch of times because it is my favorite way of playing Flames of Ignifar with an Oathkeeper. It is one of my more favored sets to play. So I have used this with multiplayer and with single player, and I only bust out the death sentence if I am in a multiplayer scenario, at which point not only am I helping myself, but I'm helping out my allies, which is quite excellent. But outside of a multiplayer context, I really don't use Word of Pain. Now, obviously, you have your shield here, which is, lovely. You're getting more stuff on the Aegis, of course. You're getting your physical damage converted to Chaos, which is another point why you don't want Aegis of Thorns once you complete this. Now, you can still use Aegis of Thorns with this part here, because if you'll notice, Aegis of Thorns converts the fire damage, not the physical. So Aegis of Thorns does physical and acid damage. But once you get this shield, it's now doing Chaos and acid damage with the Aegis of Thorns, which is still better than the Chaos and Fire. Now, anyways, back to the main point. You've got your standard stats here. Very nice. Like I said, the elemental damage is really interesting. The physical damage is kind of interesting, but a lot of your damage is being converted anyways. That does happen to work pretty well with Path of the Three, of course, but ultimately it's not a huge necessity. It doesn't stand out as being, oh wow, this is really going to change how I build whatever item. Then, of course, you have the Mantle. Again, pretty standard stuff here. Nothing of note, no conversions. Void Soul Visage. Same thing. Elemental damage converted into chaos damage some more. Again, not really a huge deal. But what else would you want to use your points for? Obviously, Word of Pain is an option, but what else could you do? Well, it really depends on a couple of different things. If you want to use ranged, it would probably be worth going into ranged expertise and running these, because you can actually get all of these at max and get some nice elemental damage out there, and also the physical damage is going to be converted over. The elemental damage is being converted. Really, the only thing that isn't being converted is the piercing damage here and here, but that's being boosted anyways, and you can use it. The piercing damage increase isn't a bad thing, because if you've been paying attention to the Chthonics, you'll notice that a lot of Chthonic enemies are resistant to vitality and chaos damage, so you do want some other damage type in there. And doing this with a ranged with a pistol, this actually gives you a decent option for at least doing some damage to Chthonics. That's entirely up to you, but I do find it very useful for that reason, and this generally, honestly, tends to be where I take this, is with a pistol, because I can take advantage of that piercing damage and actually do some meaningful damage to Chthonic enemies. This is my preference, alright? Again, if I'm in a multiplayer context, I'm actually going to be going into Word of Pain instead. Or you could alternatively go into just ranged expertise in one or two of these, and then clean up with Word of Pain if you want to. You'll also notice that I really haven't gone into Word of Renewal. Honestly, at this particular point, this is a very heavy damage build. You don't necessarily need it, but some of your other options, you might consider Inquisitor Seal. You might consider Righteous Fervor, but I still must recommend the pistol, because once they get into melee range of you, then you blast them with the fires. So basically, you throw your shield, right? You throw your Aegis of Men here. You stun as many people as possible. You pop off some shots with a complete suite of shots with the Inquisitor here. And then once they get into melee, you crisp them really good with Flames of Ignifar. And it works incredibly well. Alright? It just really, honestly, is a fantastic time. Now, you can do, if you're feeling like you are having a hard time surviving, I have experimented with this before, and I do like this as well. You don't necessarily need Path of the Three. This increases poison and acid damage, which you're not really doing. So if you feel like you don't want this, and you really want a lot more points to play with, go ahead and pull all this back. Absolutely fine. That can work really well for you. You pull all these points back, you have all of these shots here, you grab Inquisitor Seal, you grab Arcane Empowerment, and then maybe you go into Word of Renewal here. Alright? Totally up to you. Maybe you want to splash some points into Horn of Gandar. If I go this direction, I'll go into Deadly Aim at this point, just to use up my points somewhere on something decent. But you can absolutely do this. This is a much safer way of playing this. This also helps your allies if you're playing with allies as well. And if you're playing with allies and you don't want to go with Word of Pain, this also works quite well, but it's more of a defensive thing. And you can absolutely run this. You can do all of that if you really want to. Probably, honestly, this is the best way of running it. I'm just stuck on the idea. I just have a tendency to really want exclusive skills, so I tend to go for those even to my detriment. But this is honestly a much better way of going about it, because you do have the benefit of the Inquisitor Seal while you're charring people with Flames of Ignifar, and you've got that little heal if you really need it in Word of Renewal. Of course, if you're finding you're having energy problems, which you probably still will, you can put your last 9 points into Presence of Virtue for the energy regen. Right? That is also an option. I've never really particularly had a problem with energy. Well, let me rephrase that. I haven't had quite as egregious of a problem with energy, because the Void Soul does decrease the energy cost of Flames of Ignifar. You go all the way here, that's another 25%. It's what, 55? It's 55% that you're reducing. So you're cutting your energy usage here for Flames of Ignifar by over half, which is very impressive. So I've really don't find myself having too much of a problem, but that's also probably a facet of the other pieces of equipment that I've got on besides the Void Soul set. But this is a really fun set, and again, this is my favorite way of playing Flames of Ignifar with the Paladin, and this is why I really didn't necessarily recommend it in the previous one with the improv, because improving Flames of Ignifar build is tough, but with the Void Soul set, it's a beautiful time, right? So just keep that in mind. There's a couple of different ways you can run this, but it is incredibly effective. You can really easily customize it to help allies if you play multiplayer, and you can also just as easily customize it to an individual experience if you play solo. It's absolutely fantastic. If you've never experienced a Chaos Vitality Paladin, it's a really interesting time, and I do at least recommend you try it. It's a blast. So we'll kill this. Then we have Virtue's Light. Now this one is a bit more of a standard build. There's actually not a whole lot I'm going to say about this, because if you'll notice, a lot of this is increases to Aegis of Men here. I think it's almost exclusively. There's some Ascension here, but that's about it. And there's Haven as well. But of course, Haven is, no, there's Clarity of Purpose, Ascension, and Haven is this. Okay, so the only reason why I'm not going to be talking a whole lot about Virtue's Light is because if you remember from the previous episode where I talked about the Pistol Shield build, where I built Aegis of Men here, I ran Ranged Expertise and Bursting Round, right? Remember that build? And then I built Word of Renewal, and I had Divine Mandate. You run Ascension, and this is why in the previous episode I talked about Ascension. This is actually the build that I usually use for this, which is why I talked about Ascension there specifically. And then you just go into Righteous Fervor. And then if you want some more points, you can pull this all the way back if you really want to. That's totally up to you. What you want to do with your last points is entirely your decision. You could, for instance, go pull this all the way back. If you're feeling really spicy, go into Deadly Aim. Go into Presence of Virtue. Resilience? No, not Resilience. Not quite so much into Resilience anyways. Haven. Resilience. And this works out really well. But this is, you know, just basically a minor variation of the Pistol Shield skill setup that I talked about in the previous episode. It's just a very effective set for that. I've already talked about the perks of that particular setup there. The only difference is you've got Haven here, and you've pulled a whole bunch of points out of the previous thing because you're not really going for Arcane Empowerment, which is what I used without any equipment. But with the benefits of the Virtue's Light, it is actually potentially worthwhile to skip over Arcane Empowerment entirely in favor of just absolutely slap tons of damage. So, that's the best way of using that build that I've found. Again, the previous episode was more about improv, but it's just a fantastic set. So before we move on to the next one, let's just clear out the last of these points. And there we go. And of course, Safeguard is just for the increased damage, since you have a shield. Now, the Stronghold of Legion set is a bit of an interesting one because it's not specific to Paladin, but it does actually match up a lot. And again, this isn't really something I'm going to be talking a ton about because this is exactly... You're going to be building pretty basically the same as you were as previously. You've got, you know, with Righteous Fervor, everything that I just removed also applies to Stronghold of Legion. You're just not necessarily... You're just increasing all your skills across the board. And you have the Gunner's Aegis, which is really nice. You have Concussive Round, that's really nice. And you've got the Stun Blast that the whole set gives you. It's a nice little set. Works very well with a lot of Monster and Frequents. I'll talk about that in the next episode. Great set. This one's a fun one, but it plays very similar to Virtue's Light. So really not much to talk about here. Stoneguard is a melee setup, obviously, because you've got the one-handed mace. But, once again, there's not really a whole lot to talk about because you are basically just running you're running the melee version, so you would still be going into Righteous Fervor, you would still want to be going into, Word of Renewal, while I was having a brain cramp, you would still probably want to go into Inquisitor Seal, you would want to go into Divine Mandate. It's very similar. The only difference is, from the ranged build we just talked about, is instead of Ranged Expertise and Bursting Round, you're going into Inquisitor Seal and Arcane Empowerment, you're going here into Word of Renewal, you're not going into this, you're just going into this, and whatever else you feel the need for. I often actually I will put the points in here really quick so I can show you. I do actually make more of a variation than I was really describing. Go into Word of Renewal here. We won't go into that. Go into Safeguard, Smite, which is what I also usually do, Shattering Smash. Go into here, pull back these 10 points, pull in Vigor. And then at this particular point, it's really up to you how you want to run this specifically. A point in Virus Might is usually where I roll. I'll usually put points into Resilience. But again, you don't necessarily have to. If you want instead to put points into Deadly Aim, that's fine. But that's how I'll usually run it. Again, you've seen this before. It's just with a specific set and a mild adjustment to accommodate that set a little bit more. That's really it. Again, another great little set. Lots of fun to play. A lot of flexibility there. But ultimately, there's not a ton to necessarily say about it, because, again, it's very similar to builds we've already talked about in the previous episode. I just wanted to point out the kind of really great points of sets and some, baseline ideas. Again, you can wander off the beaten path that I'm talking about here, because this is just what I find effective for me. What you find effective depends on your favorites. But this is one of the sets that I would like to use in hardcore, because this actually gives you a pretty good shot at, not dying. But that's for another day. The Gore Drinker. Now, personally, this is my least favorite set. I've only played with this once because I really don't like it. And the reason why I don't like it is because there is an increase in bleeding damage here, which neither the Inquisitor nor the Oathkeeper really do. It's really more intended for Soldier Inquisitor or Soldier and Oathkeeper, and even then, it's still not one of my favorite sets. So, alright, let me go through here. Right, so we've got all of these stuffs here, right? Now, this is a set that when I ran this set, the one time, I used two-handed weapons, because obviously it's increasing pierce damage, and obviously we have Word of Pain. Ding-da-ding. Right, and then you'll also notice, hey, Virus Might. Which, I actually wound up trying this with melee first. I used a melee weapon and a shield, but in all honesty, well, yes, there's some bleeding damage on Tectonic Shift, and that's nice and all. It's really the only primary source of bleeding damage here. There's a little bit of bleeding on Presence of Virtue, but that's, whatever. It's very mild. Yes, you can reduce bleeding resistance with Celestial Presence. It's just not something I'm overly fond of overall. I mean, you're just increasing Death Sentence, Presence of Virtue. I forgot about that, to be completely honest. You can play, like I said, I played this with a ranged weapon. I played this with two-handed. Ranged Expertise, I used Chilling Rounds, I used Storm Spread. I removed that specifically because I didn't want to necessarily color your ideas. At least, retrospectively, I probably shouldn't have put those points in right then and there. You get bleeding damage on Word of Pain and Pierce damage. It's just very... So, if you want to do the ranged, obviously you're going to be running Ranged Expertise. You could splash in Chilling Rounds and Storm Spread if you want to. And then if you're doing the melee, you obviously use a shield, so you can use Fire's Might, get the bleed here. I just am not fond of it. I'll either go Divine Mandate if I'm melee, or I'll go Aura of Conviction if I'm ranged. And I'm saying this with both because, again, I did start using this set with melee, switched to range, and just both ways I wasn't really happy with it. Now, in its defense, I didn't play this multiplayer, and I feel like the Death Sentence would be a little bit more useful there, so I would like to retry this set and a build around this set. I would like to try it again in a multiplayer context, because I feel like maybe it would be a little bit better there, but that remains to be tested. So, that's just something that I do want to test in the future. It's just something I haven't just gotten around to. But overall, I'm just not as fond of this. The only way I've used the Gore Drinker set and been happy with it was a Soldier Oathkeeper build, and even then, there are better sets for that, in all honesty. I'm just not fond of this particular set. It's just really not something it's just not how I play, really. The fact that fire damage is converted to pierce damage, yay, more fire damage converted to pierce damage here. Actually, there is something I want to point out, is that you actually have a really interesting and great opportunity. No, it doesn't double convert, never mind. Forgot it doesn't double convert. But, I mean, it's already being physically converted into piercing damage anyways. That's where I was getting the pierce damage from. I was like, I know I got more pierce damage out of fires. I'm like, yeah, it's because the set was doing it, not because I converted this and then converted afterwards. Brain cramp. Anyways, I'm not a huge fan of this set, at least with this combination, but there are ways you can run this. Again, if you're going to use ranged, you're going to be going into ranged expertise, probably chilling rounds in Storm Spread. If you're going melee, you're probably just going with maybe Safeguard and Smite. Maybe not. I can't be too authoritative on the melee because I only played that for a brief amount of time. But yeah, moving on from the Gore Drinker, which is my least favorite, Bonemonger. Now this one was a little bit of a struggle to actually put together and use sanely, but it is fairly interesting. Now this is a Aether and Elemental one with an interesting trick. Now you'll notice, obviously, we have Inquisitor's Seal here. Pull this out here. Put this in here. There we go. And then we have Smite. Come on, there we go. So we have Smite. I pretty much by default run Safeguard here. I've played this set a couple times. This one is one I've tested in multiplayer and in single player. I also throw in Righteous Fervor, because of course. Now, besides all that, nothing else really goes up here. We have Inquisitor's Seal, Guardian of Empyrean. Forgot about that. And that's a lot of this build, right? Now, personally, I've always had a preference for running Divine Mandate here, just because you're not converting a whole lot out of Righteous Fervor, and even though Smite now does Aether damage, right? Right here, Aether damage to Smite, and you're getting a lot of conversions over to damage. Well, I think a lot is a bit extreme, but physical damage being converted to Aether, which is nice. Vitality is being converted to Aether, which we don't care about. Vitality. That's more for the Necromancer portion. But a little bit of your physical damage is being converted to Aether, but again, that doesn't really make a huge difference. But you're basically running Aether, Fire, and Physical. And while it's a really fascinating build to play, I can't say it's one of my favorites, because just you don't have a ton of Aether damage options. Now, again, you could always pull this back here, put 9 points into Stormbox, and go into Alagast's Arcane Net. Not a huge fan of that, because I find it only 9 points. Stormbox really isn't hitting that hard, or hard enough to actually make a huge difference. But it's a really interesting build to play. It's fun to play, but it's pretty tough to actually get to work the way you want it to. So I do recommend some caution here. This is definitely one of those builds you throw together to just kick back and have a laugh at, because you're really not going to be seeing a whole lot of really hardcore end game combat going on out of this, just because of the nature of how difficult it is to incorporate Aether damage into the Paladin. So I do warn you of that. Now, Wake of Bones, of course, is nice for this, but it's also increasing cold damage, which doesn't really get boosted a whole lot within here, especially if you're going melee, which you probably are. You would really technically need to be, because Smite and Shattering Smash, so technically you're guaranteed to be going melee. But it's just, it is fun, but it's just not that effective in this context. So there's that. Then we have Stonefather, which is not too different from the one before that we talked about with the Oathkeeper boosts, except in this particular case, we're doing Virus Might. Now, I'm actually not going to put the points in here because there's really not a whole lot going on here. There's Virus Might increases. It's pretty basic. Since it is only increasing the Oathkeeper skills, you really have free reign to do whatever. I do tend to play that with a melee. I've actually used that set a couple of times more as filler in while I was getting other sets. We're getting together other sets. So I've used this a decent bit, and I've always used it as a kind of stopgap, because it's just a little bit easier to find, it's a little bit easier to get, because it is epic rather than legendary, like the other sets we've been talking about. But really, the thing that I really have a problem here is that this is just so well put together for Oathkeepers that there's not a whole lot of justified reasoning to necessarily use anything else, unless you really want to play a melee pistol build where you're building Virus Might and you're running ranged expertise and Shattering Blast? Bursting Round, pardon me. The only things I really pull out of the Inquisitor here are sometimes Inquisitor Seal, definitely Word of Renewal at least to this point, usually up to Steel of Resolve, and I'll just build these two, and then just run Virus Might and whatever else I want, really. Again, I'll usually use Divine Mandate, so I'll usually pull the points back here to the 40 point so I can get Arcane Empowerment. But again, it's a very basic kind of set. I definitely use it more as a stopgap than anything else. If you're really fond of it, that's fine. But there's just not a whole lot it does that you can't also do in other sets. It doesn't do anything particularly interesting in terms of the stats of individual pieces of equipment, and it doesn't really have anything particularly interesting in its set completion stats either. It's just a very okay set to use. It is very pliable. You can do a lot with it. It's just a matter of what do you feel like doing with it. But again, I usually just run melee with a shield there, get Virus Might, and then use the Inquisitor for the heal and the Arcane Sigil. The Inquisitor Seal, that's the one. So that's generally how I approach this. Keeper of the Blaze. This is a bit more interesting because it actually is designed for the Paladin. Except we have Chaos damage converted to fire damage, which is more as in line with the Demolitionist, but we can ignore that pretty safely. Now, again, there's not a whole lot of crazy stats here. We do have the Mythical Flamekeepers. I didn't want to pull that. We do have the Mythical Flamekeepers Repeater. Obviously, this is a two-handed ranged build, but there's not a ton that necessarily are running. Now, they have Virus Might here. I'm going to be really honest, I don't run Virus Might with this set. I know. It increases Virus Might, whatever. Yeah, I really don't care. The two-handed ranged build that I discussed in the previous episode, yeah, this is the set that I usually use that with. In all honesty, I just don't build Virus Might. I don't care. I just go Righteous Fervor. I go into ranged expertise and bursting round. I do everything that I mentioned in the previous episode with the two-handed ranged. This is the set I use it for, Keeper of the Blaze. This is that set. Great set for that reason, except for I never build Virus Might. If I'm using range, it's because I want to be away from the enemy. I'm not going to be dashing at them with Virus Might. So, that's really the only difference here. But it's basically just a two-handed ranged weapon. Actually, it's almost exactly the two-handed ranged build that I run. It just depends on what other items I'm equipped with at the time. But the two-handed ranged skill setup that I talked about in the last episode is approximately what I build with this set. And then we have the Luminary Regalia, which is, for me, the most fascinating in terms of its stats, because it actually has sleep resistance, which is fairly fascinating. Very interesting indeed. But the actual set itself individually is fairly interesting, and this is the set that I will use dual-wielding pistols, because here's a pistol here. I'll actually bust out two of these if I can get them, ideally. But yeah, this is the one context in which I will dual wield. Well, I won't say it's the one context. There is another context. Actually, there's a couple of contexts. But set-wise, this is the set that I'll use for dual wielding. Because obviously we have this specific pistol here. I like to dual wield these. And basically, I'm running ranged expertise. I'm running bursting round. I'm running chilling rounds. I run storm spread. And the only thing I really pull out of Oathkeeper is Righteous Fervor. Okay. I run this, and that's basically it. That's all I really take out of here. That's the only reason I go into the Oathkeeper for this set at all. And then of course, I use Word of Renewal. I'll usually use Deadly Aim, but not always, but we'll put it in there for now. I will bust out Aura of Conviction. I will usually bust out Horn of Gandar as my sort of safety net. I will use Inquisitor Seal for the same kind of thing. And then at this point, I'll usually just throw points into Vigor and Steel Resolve. But yeah, this is the dual-wielding set, alright? And again, this is how I usually will run it. You have a lot of boosts to a lot of these. +1 to all skills in Inquisitor, obviously. And then you've got the increased Inquisitor Seal and Arcane Empowerment, which is why I actually use those as my defense. You don't necessarily need to in normal circumstances, but they are being boosted. They do help keep you alive, even if you're dual-wielding pistols. We have Bursting Round and Storm Spread here. Chilling Rounds here, Ranged Expertise here. It's really obvious what this is designed for, and it's just really effective at it. So don't be afraid to just go right with that. But the increases generated from Righteous Fervor are quite impressive. It's really nice. And again, your last 14 points, Vigor and some into Steel Resolve for whatever. If you want more Steel Resolve, just take the points out of Deadly Aim. I just prefer Deadly Aim because it increases my damage, and if you're on a tight spot, you know, your enemies are knocking at your Inquisitor Seal, Deadly Aim can really come in handy. But this is the dual-wielding pistol build that I'll use, well, the dual-wielding pistol set. But those are the sets for the Paladin. You may have noticed that there isn't a ton of variation here. I covered a lot of the general points of these builds in the previous episode, with a couple of exceptions. The Paladin is a beautifully straightforward class, which is why it's a lot of fun to play, actually. It's really easy to just coordinate this into a really powerful build. And there are a couple of wacky sets in there that you can really go wild with, if you really feel like to. And there are some really nice, clean sets that are very easy to understand, that are very easy to put together. And this is actually a really great class to play for beginners for that reason. As I mentioned in the previous episode, it's very easy to see your way clear to a strong fire damage-based build with the Paladin. Just as easily, you can see your way clear to a really fantastic endgame build very easily and very obviously in some of the sets available to the Paladin, especially its epic sets, which are a little bit easier to get and are much more straightforward in their point. And it's just a great set for newer players to get behind if they really want to start looking for that endgame. So, with that being said, I do hope you enjoyed this. Next episode of this mini-series, I'm going to be talking about the individual pieces, the individual legendary and epic pieces, by the way. I'm going to get into the Monster and Frequents after that in its own episode, because the Monster and Frequents, I also want to talk about farming them, which is going to take some time, and I just don't want to conglomerate that into all one episode. This episode ended very nicely at half an hour, roughly half an hour, which is what I was shooting for. Last time I did one of these with all the items, it took like an hour and a half or an hour or something like that. It was a ridiculous amount of time, and that was just far too long for the context of the episode. But a half an hour is what I was shooting for, and I've approximately reached that. So that's really nice to see that this worked out and is working out the way I want it to. But these were the sets for the Paladin. So if you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.